Now it's up to the audience. I think it goes without saying. All comments, please be brief and concise, but to the point. We have one here by Andrea Terzi over there in the red pullover. Next one is Marc Lavoie. Okay, and then we come to the next two.
Just can I say I'm a feminist. I encourage women to also put their hand up so we don't have
Yes.
gender distribution.
Question for Gennaro. Since you called for this question, I'd like you to elaborate further on the fiscal currencies project, and particularly on the on what seems to be a fundamental problem that I understand there are legal opinions that this is compatible with the treaty. But it remains the fact that if this is done by one single country, like Italy, for example, it may be problematic. And it should probably be a European agreement about introducing fiscal currencies in all countries. But if we need the agreement of the European Union, then the likelihood of that agreement is just as much as a fiscal union. And the second question for Peter, I appreciate your narrative about the markets being fascinated by the magician Draghi, but clearly markets were very reasonable when they responded, because it was clear there was a change in regime. And I don't know if this narrative can be confirmed, but as far as Monti tells about those months, the green light to Draghi was given by the Eurogroup in June by the politicians who gave the green light to the independent ECB to go ahead with that project. And so if that's true, then we should not blame the ECB for having delayed until 2012 the QE, the OMT. I'm sorry for the OMT. Thanks.
Okay, we collect. One is Mark.
Yes, thank you. Also a question for Peter Bofinger. At some point you said that in 2007 the ECB should have done much more, and you showed us figures of the current account deficits, of the evolution of the wage differentials, and there was a third one, I forget. Also, yes, the way credit was expanding in some countries and not in others. And I wonder, what could the ECB have done about these three variables? And perhaps just a comment on Trichet. We had Jean-Claude Trichet coming to our university in Paris 13 on 3 or 4 occasions. And on each occasion, he said, well, I would have liked to do much more in May 2010, but as soon as I lifted my little finger, the German press was all against me. So to some extent, it was the Germans that were stopping Trichet.
Okay, again, the Germans. Thanks. Next one, Thomas.
Yeah, Thomas Denwald from the IMK. Daniela, thank you very much for this presentation. The only question I have, where exactly in your transmissions is the role for private investor? If I remember correctly, there have been similar papers, 2012 by André Schleifer and co-authors, and they start all this with the need for coming from private investors for high yield, and then you have an impulse also coming from a very skewed wealth distribution becoming more unequal.
Okay, thanks. There was some colleague behind. So last question of the first round, but there will be a second round.
I'm Ben Piening. I'm studying at the University of Hamburg. I'm not much older than the euro, but I still have the feeling that the heterodox community has been talking about the institutional flaws of the eurozone for 20 years now. So my question is, what are the actors in politics and society that we have to work together with to change the Eurozone and to get the change starting.
Okay, so Daniela is currently writing, so let's start with Gennaro.
So Andrea asked if this proposal for a fiscal currency is legal under the treaties. Now, this is an open question, and the point is that there are different flavors of fiscal currencies. There are different proposals. Basically, there are some who just want to start with a clearing system, which would make a government debt with, say, firms more liquid. So that if the government is illiquid but solvent, it could pay firms with some new financial thing that can be used by the firm to pay taxes and that can eventually be traded. So this is one of the proposals. Another one is similar but is issuing a piece of paper which can be used for paying taxes after 2 or 3 years. And the proponents have asked both the ECB and somebody else, I think in Brussels, on whether this is legal, and apparently it is legal. There are some subtleties on whether it will be counted as debt or not. So somebody say, if you do this, then you spend 10 billion euro creating this new liquid assets, your debt will increase by 10 billion euro. It's okay to me, but maybe not to the fiscal compact rule. But as somebody said before, fortunately, everyone is ignoring the fiscal compact rule. So can this be done in one country if the proponent is reasonable and is not Lega Nord? Maybe it's going to be accepted. And I agree with you. If it has to be done by an agreement at the Eurozone level, it's never going to happen. Never going to happen.
Okay, you're right with the Draghi effect. Of course, the market somehow expected that something will happen, but nevertheless, I think it was quite magical. So the question is, should we defend Trichet? If you look back at these times, the ECB was criticizing governments all the time for not doing structural reforms, for deficits being too high. And so why should not they have addressed the problem of the discrepancy of unit labor costs, saying we observe a discrepancy of unit labor costs, which threatens the transmission of our monetary policy and which creates high real interest rates in countries like Germany and very low interest rates in countries like Spain. That threatens our monetary policy. Why not say this? And why not address the increase in bank lending in Spain and Greece? By the way, so when you talk so much about the shadow banks, I would say the crisis in the euro crisis was just regular banking. There was no shadow. There was the banks in Spain lending heavily, the banks in Ireland lending heavily, and they were refinanced by the German banks. So it was completely banking. So the whole euro crisis, everything was maybe very little securitized, but overall it was just classical banking. The German banks refinanced, French banks refinanced, the Spanish banks, the Greek banks. It was 100% banking. So I don't understand this so much. And I also just made comment this. I'm also wondering why when you talk about securities markets or bond markets, why you call it shadow banking. So that's also of course, you can do it, but shadow banking, when it was really a problem, were these structured investment vehicles used by banks like IKB in 2007 or 2008, where they did real banking, but somewhere in Ireland also. But that was real shadow banking. But you talk very often about what I think is just bond market, and why call the bond market shadow banking? So that's okay. That's a question aside. So the German press, well, I think that's a good thing. So Draghi doesn't care about the German press. Maybe you have to be a little bit courageous as ECB president when you really want to maintain your currency. And so I think I wouldn't accept this as a valid argument. And how to change the overall attitude toward the Eurozone. Of course, I think especially in Germany, there's a responsibility of politicians to defend the ECB. And that's something which is lacking. I didn't hear a word from any responsible politician in Germany defending the ECB when it was attacked like this in the public. Why is Mrs. Merkel, why is Mr. Schulz not going to the public and say, hey, this ECB has a lot to do with the tremendous and impressive increase in jobs that we have observed over the last few years with the impressive growth of German GDP. So I think there is really a backing missing, especially if Draghi is attacked so much in the press that no German politician is defending the ECB is something which is really detrimental to the way we discuss about the euro, and of course it's also detrimental towards the way we see Europe. And so I think there's also a real problem with our politicians.
Yeah, do you want to applaud? Okay, so can I just start by disagreeing with esteemed colleague on the right? I think first I would say that there is a certain temptation to think to exoticize shadow banking as being these very complicated structured products that were produced in the US, hidden off balance sheets. And that is indeed part of the shadow banking universe, but that is a small part of the shadow banking universe. And the Financial Stability Board and almost every central bank that I can think of are distinguishing between entities and activities. And activities like securities financing transactions or bond financing through repo markets of bonds is part of the shadow banking universe in the way that every regulatory initiative has treated them since 2008. I mean, we might disagree whether that's a good idea or not, but this is how it has been treated, in part because your ability to finance your securities positions through the repo market is generating the kind of banking that we think of in terms of liquidity and in terms of leverage. So I will just say that. I will also disagree with you about the nature of the European banking crisis. I am reminded about a paper by Hyung-Sung Shin, who made immediately after 2008, he started a set of series of papers showing the exposure of European banks towards the shadow banking universe in the US, and that exposure left them open to funding problems in US dollars and started the tremors in the euro area. Okay, well, we are having a debate without microphone. I have a microphone. We can. I mean, yes, I'm from the periphery. I'm taking some stuff from the Germans every day.
No, I only want to say I was talking about the euro crisis, what was happening within Europe, and that had, in my view, very little to do with shadow banking. You're completely right that the German banks had a lot of troubles with the shadow banks, but these were the real shadow banks, but the euro crisis itself, all the disequilibria within Europe were classical banking, not shadow.
Yes, but I would agree that there were very significant disequilibria, and I would stress with Hyung-Sung Shin that we shouldn't think about current account deficits as a way to think through the disequilibria, but we should think about gross capital flows. And what we see after the collapse of Lehman Brothers are difficulties of European banks to finance in US dollars, and they are forced to go into financing at the ECB, and you can see stress in repo markets, in the European repo markets, and stress in collateral in Greek and Irish government bond markets since September 2008 for a lot of the reasons that you explained. So I would strongly disagree that the European banking crisis only became real when Spanish banks could no longer, when austerity in Spain no longer allowed Spanish borrowers to pay back their loans to Spanish banks. The European banking crisis started as a crisis of wholesale funding in euro area repo markets. We can disagree about that. Maybe I'll send you an email with the references. But the Bank for International Settlements has lots of papers on that. What is the role for private investors? I didn't have time to elaborate on it, but the European technocrats who are pushing my definition of shadow banking, which includes the repo markets, were riding the wave of financial capitalism and were accelerating financial capitalism that comes with an erosion of the welfare state. So the growth of shadow banking and the kind of shadow entities that Peter typically refers to has to do with the erosion of the welfare state, the fact that we get institutional investors growing very rapidly through private pension funds and public pension funds, through insurance companies, through high net worth individuals. So it was there. They did very little to stop it because, 30 years of neoliberalism was very convenient. And I would say that in terms of the actors and politics that we need in order to change Europe, I mean, in a sense, it's nice to bash to bash Trichet, but I think we also have to think more structurally about the way in which modern finance operates. And we have to think through the politics that is hidden in the technicalities of modern finance. And those politics have a lot to do with fiscal space. So I would actually, I'm reminded that, what's the name of the Italian, Salvini once said that before he wakes up, before he calls his children in the morning, he checks the spread on Italian bonds. The way in which these spreads are evolving reflect also financial market structures and the way in which the European finance treats government bonds as good collateral or not.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's have a second round of questions. And besides, we have already a few. Besides what Daniela said, I would also like to encourage younger researchers. So, and women, surely. So let's start with Maria Paschi here. And then there were a lot of people over there. Maybe the 1 second microphone can go to that quarter. And, So let's start with your question.
Okay, I'm Marianne Pasi. I'm at Technical University of Berlin. I come to the last thing you have on your slide. Well, thank you very much for the
Just.
Okay, sorry. Yeah. Thank you very much for your presentations. I come now. Maybe this goes a little bit to another direction, but to the issue of a Green New Deal. I'm an innovation economist, so challenges are opportunities. But the thing is, of course, how do we get the new Green Deal or the transition to the low-carbon economy financed? And you already said, in times when we have these masses of liquidity, which seems not to be very productive for the society, so it is indeed, I think, a very important political issue to get the guiding there. And of course what we need is in other areas is the carbon price is the first thing, of course, things like circular economy with regulations and so on and so on. But now I come to you who understand something about the finance. So what type of financial instruments are there which could get the job done for financing the new economy, but also in the same time, how could this type of transition or its finance also stabilize other parts of the financial market and the government's role and things like that. So this goes a little bit to a different direction, but I think it's an important issue also for the young generation.
So, thank you very much. So I didn't get who raised his or her hand. So, you already selected one. Fine, then we continue with you over there. And last question here, maybe last question for the second round. Yes, please.
Thanks for the talk. I have a question to you, Daniela. The first one is the cases that were filed against the banking union and the purchasing program of the ECB, if that created kind of the market setup, maybe in the short term or in the long term, or if it was really just the ECB policies on which that you've been stressing, if that had any effect. And the second question was how is it about fiscal austerity, as it still constitutes a post-crisis kind of policy attitude, we can say. How is that continues to shape markets, and is it not counterproductive in one sense? And which is not only the case in the EU, but also in other countries. So is there like a common move towards a setup in the system through those kind of combinations of policies? Yeah, thanks.
Okay, so thanks. We collect 3 more questions. Okay, yes, him, and then over there. And final question is Professor Skidelski.
Hi, my name is Michalis Nikiforos from the Levy Institute in New York. I have a comment more than a question, because we're talking about Draghi and Trichet. So when I agree that without the whatever it takes claim, the Eurozone would have collapsed. But I think at the same time we should keep in mind that this whatever it takes is still conditional on austerity policies being applied. So in Greece, the capital controls in June 2015 were imposed during Mr. Draghi's tenure, and it's. I think this is something we should keep in mind. And actually, the austerity policies are enforced through this implicit threat of the ECB that will not provide liquidity to the banking system of any country that will not follow the rules.
Yeah, please hand over to, yes, exactly, the woman.
Thank you for your interesting talks. I'm a beginner in the field, so that would explain my next questions. I thought you spoke about fiscal currency. Should I think about, for instance, like gold or the special drawing rights, that it would be estimated each currency of a country to those, perhaps? And what would be the consequence? You said something about it, but I didn't understand it that much. Would I be looking at that the debts of the governments will be vanished, and also mortgages of human citizens will also be gone? Another question, it was some of you said that that the number of inflation was 1.7%. I can hardly believe that. What do you think would be the real number of inflation?
Okay, thank you very much. So, last speaker here. And then, unfortunately, I guess we have to close at least this round. So, yes, please.
This is a comment rather than a question on all the presentations, which were really very interesting. I mean, I want to stick up a little bit for politicians here. I mean, no one really says anything good about the way they behave, but we've really got to oppose the narrative that it was central bankers to the rescue. I mean, we've already heard that it was politicians who gave the green light to Draghi and allowed him to do whatever. And even earlier, I mean, the response of the G7 to the onset of the crisis was a political response, mainly politicians who, out of instinct of self-preservation, actually overruled a lot of the orthodox economic advice they were getting. So they ought to be given a bit of credit for that. But at the same time, deadly economic orthodoxy also had its effect, and I just give one anecdote of that. When I was on the Parliamentary Economic Affairs Committee, we had George Osborne before us giving evidence, and I asked him, I said, which were the economists that have influenced you most in your austerity policy? And he said, Alesina and Gavazzi and Rogoff and Reinhardt. Yeah, well, there you are.
Thank you. Can I just say that I was at the IMF World Bank meeting last week in Washington, and Rogoff was on one panel and Alesina was on the other. So that tells you something about the end of austerity. They are. Being a white man seems you don't have to pay for your mistakes. That is sorry to say this. Okay, so. Yes. They didn't accept questions. I had them prepared. Okay, so can I go back to what type of financial instruments are there to finance the Green New Deal? And I would say that there is a lot of discussion about green bonds and the way in which, and here in Germany, there are discussions about Germany issuing green government bonds, which would be welcome even for the story that I'm telling. Whatever types of government bonds that Germany issues are good. Having said that, there is a broader conversation that I think we should all be aware of that is taking place now in Brussels, and it's also taking place in European capitals, which is that we need first a way of distinguishing between green and brown financial instruments that is not simply thinking about issuing a particular type of financial instrument, but looking at the balance sheet of every financial institution and working out how much of that balance sheet is financing brown activities or fossil fuel activities. And once the European Commission is setting up a taxonomy for green and brown, and once that taxonomy is in place, the question that we have on the table is whether the ECB will take monetary policy measures in order to punish brown assets. Because at the moment, the collateral framework of the ECB does not distinguish between brown and green assets, and that means that the ECB is implicitly subsidizing brown assets in that sense, right? So that is, if we think about the politics of the relationship between the technocrats and the politicians, a big fight is coming on the climate change agenda, because there are many people who believe central banks shouldn't be in the business of dealing with climate change. Interestingly, central banks think they should be in the business of dealing with climate change because of the financial stability issues there. I'm not sure I understood the question, whether it was the legal challenges that Germany put to the various actions of the ECB, whether they made a difference or not. I would just say that once the OMT program was in place, then that is an implicit liquidity backstop for government bond markets, and it is an implicit liquidity backstop for a market-based financial system. So in that sense, it doesn't matter that much unless, of course, that would have come, the court would have said, no, you can't do it. But I don't think any lawyer in the Eurozone would have really wanted responsibility for destroying the euro area. And in terms of the relationship with fiscal austerity, there is a long conversation that has been taking place in European technocratic circles about a shortage of safe assets that is affecting the Eurozone, precisely because the financial crisis has destroyed the safe asset qualities of many government bonds. And you should, if you're interested, there is a speech by Benoît Cœuré in 2016 where he elaborates on some of these issues. And what we have now is a very technocratic solution to a very political problem, and that is the idea of securitizing government bonds in the euro area. It's called the SBIS project, or the securitizing sovereign bonds. And the idea is to somehow bring back a process of integrating government bond markets, but through securitization. Private finance doesn't like it. Debt management offices in every capital don't like it. I don't think it will work. So we are in the same position that we were in 2008, in a sense that the European euro area governments made a liquidity pact with shadow banking, and that's very important when we think about conditionality. They made a liquidity pact that said, if you allow your government bonds to, if you liberalize your repo markets and you allow your government bonds to be part of these collateral networks, then you'll get more liquidity and you don't have to worry. Now they know that's not true, and the only answer to that is, on the fiscal side, is austerity, in hope that private finance will not turn against them. Oh, no, you can have mine.
No, that's fine. Okay, about austerity, I still think that we haven't seen that much austerity in the last few years. I think that's something one has to accept. I think the only exception is Greece. That's what I said. Yeah, Greece, they were the poor guys who could not afford to have these high deficits. But in the rest, if you really look at Spain, at France, so there is not, nobody is going to zero. Making a major attempt to fulfill this fiscal compact, so I would say that there has been a change. And given the deteriorating economic climate in the Eurozone, I also don't think that we will see additional austerity. It will rather go to in the other direction. But with the Green New Deal, I think that would be a completely new discussion. I think there are different ways to finance it. Of course, if I could wish it, I would say yes, a green euro bond would be wonderful. So my idea would be say, okay, let's formulate a euro area, a EU program for innovation, for green technology, for Green New Deal. Let's define the elements of this program, and of course the the amount of money that is involved, and this amount of money we allow to be financed with green Eurobonds. That would be, and you could justify it because there are so many externality involved, so that would be my, if I could wish it, but I'm also realistic enough that with these wishes it's a problem. So a more modest idea could be to say, well, give countries some leeway in the Stability and Growth Pact to finance green investments with deficits, and also again define it. So my idea would always define the elements of this program, what counts as green, and of course that's something that's supposed to be discussed. But to define the green program and say only for those specific projects, this kind of additional financial leeway can be used, so that the neoliberals cannot say, well, we want to give governments more money to consume, and so that would be the thing that I would prefer. Well, with the real number of inflation, this is always an average, this inflation rate, and how you feel it depends on how far you deviate from your consumption patterns from the average. Yeah, of course, it's not true for everyone. It's an average, and if, I don't know. So in my hometown, people like to drink a lot of wine. Say, well, if you look at the glass of wine, the price has, I don't know, increased by a factor of something, much more than the inflation rate. You say, yes, the more wine you drink, the more you deviate from this average, and the more. And you're right. And so therefore one has always to be careful questioning this. I have the feeling, I don't know, that the statistical offices are trying to do a good job to do it as best as they can. But one has to be aware, if I feel that my inflation is different, that doesn't mean that the inflation as it is measured as an average is wrong. Okay, great for the politicians. Yeah, I did a lot for Draghi. No, didn't I do that? And of course, and you're right. I think what's really important is that in this great financial crisis, that the governments reacted quite nicely. I think it took the Germans took a long time until Mr. Steinbrück realized it. He was the real laggard. But overall, I think that was, in my view, a nice Keynesian way to deal with the crisis. And it worked. I think that's why we should be confident as Keynesians. So there was a Keynesian theory be applied to a Keynesian problem. And overall, in a very short period of time, the global economy went back to growth. I think that was in my view, a success story for Keynesian demand management, monetary policy, fiscal policy. And the only area where they didn't apply it consequently enough, in the Eurozone, they got a second recession. So I think that's like the picture book of Keynes. No?
Okay, so I understand I didn't give a simple definition of what a fiscal currency is. And basically, you can think of it as a tax rebate, but it's not exactly a tax rebate. So you can think of it as a piece of paper which the government says, I'm ready to accept this piece of paper for the nominal value of 10 euro in tax payment. Okay? The point is, you don't want this to be used immediately for a tax payment. Otherwise, you just reduce taxes, and you should have a similar effect. The idea is that you put it into the system so that this piece of paper is spent by those who receive it, who maybe does not need to pay taxes because she's poor, but she can buy food or whatever, and who receives this piece of paper can spend it again and again, so that it generates some multiple effect on sales, output, and so on. And we estimated the likely impact on this kind of expenditure. Obviously, the proposal would not be to give pieces of paper. Well, this was actually the proposal of Liga Nord, to issue government debt in very small denomination, like 1 euro, 10 euro, that could be used like banknotes. But I think this would not have been so effective. But anyway, this is how things would work. I only wanted to add one comment on the Green New Deal and how to finance it. I think that before discussing how to finance it, which can be done with traditional instruments, it would be very effective if investment expenditure, and especially so-called green investment, would be taken out of the parameters of the Maastricht Treaties. There has been a decline in public investment overall for governments who has to abide to the Maastricht rules. So getting investment out of the 3% rule would be the first move that could be hopefully easily achieved.
Okay, I know that not all questions could have been raised, and maybe not all questions are answered yet, but we have further sessions tomorrow. We have a further plenary session tomorrow. So I hope that all remaining questions can be solved one room nearby where the dinner is waiting for us. So I would like to invite you to go to the next room. But before we do that, thanks very much to all the participants and the speakers.